Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to address the conference again, as you said, sadly, virtually once again, which we'd hope to avoid this year. But let's hope we're close to turning the corner on this pandemic and endless COVID restrictions, and that we will be able to return to normal next year. Now, today, I just wanted to set out a little bit of further detail about our future agriculture policy. And to start with, I think it's important to note that EU area payments that we've all come used to in the last 15 years or so are a relatively new concept. They came out of the 2003 CAP reform, and in some ways they were born out of an economist's obsession with so-called decoupling. But what's become increasingly apparent in recent years is that a subsidy on land ownership or land tenure can be every bit as distorting as an old-style production subsidy. It's inflated land rents. It's caused people to hold on to land just to collect the payment when they might otherwise rent that land out. And with hindsight, therefore, the advent of area-based subsidies was probably a mistake in my view. A better approach with hindsight might have been to, first of all, start to introduce environmental conditionality to the previous support regime that was in place. Secondly, to progressively reduce the size of those subsidies and to simultaneously increase the payment rates in the agri-environment schemes in the old Pillar 2 of the Common Agricultural Policy. And so the concept behind the approach that we are taking now to future policy is fundamentally different to that which we inherited from the EU. Whereas the EU regime was very much a single subsidy based on land ownership and land tenure, and then a single complex book of rules that everybody needed to follow. The new approach will be phasing out those subsidies for land ownership and land tenure. It will dispense with that old style, rigid, top-down rule book. And instead, we will be replacing the schemes with new payments to incentivize sustainable farming. Now, these new payments will not begrudge farmers a margin for doing the right thing for the environment. And in that sense, they will represent a departure from the income foregone principle that was used by the European Union. Rates instead will be set at the level needed to incentivize uptake required on the scale we need to deliver our environmental objectives. Now, I know that for understandable reasons, farmers sometimes approach this issue of agriculture policy reform, with the question, how will I recoup the money that I currently receive through BPS? But for government, the question is slightly different. We have now legally binding targets for the environment, most notably a target to reverse the decline in nature by 2030. And we have a responsibility as a government to ensure that the payment rates we make are attractive enough to incentivize the uptake of our schemes on the scale needed so that we can hit the targets we've set ourselves and to which we are legally bound to deliver. So the key difference with our future scheme is that we are seeking willing participants who are attracted to the schemes because of the payment rates we're making. The new schemes will be modular. Some businesses may embrace the scheme at all its levels and embrace it with a high level of ambition. But for other businesses, it may be a smaller part of their overall business model. The key thing is that the choice will be theirs. And the shape of our future policy is already starting to emerge, and we're already rolling out elements of it. We have already launched our new animal health and welfare pathway. This means that any livestock farmer who's currently a claimant of BPS will be entitled to a funded visit from a vet once a year to put in place an animal health strategy. Now, we know that for many farm businesses, calling the vet is an expensive business, usually reserved for times of crisis, often in the middle of the night when something's going wrong when they're calving a cow. But we also know that the difference between the best financial performance on livestock enterprises and those that are suffering from poor profitability is often very closely linked to animal health on the farm. And we know that if we can reduce mortality on farms, if we can reduce conditions such as mastitis in the cattle sector, and if we can address issues such as lameness in the sheep sector, these can all have a direct impact on a farm enterprise's profitability. And so having an annual visit from a vet with a more strategic focus about how to enhance animal health on an individual holding, I think could have a really powerful impact. I've had some farmers say to me, well, I already do this, in which case they will now receive a payment for something they already do. But for those who don't already do this, I hope that they will take up this payment, since it's not going to cost them anything to do it. And we will be rolling out other components of support to enhance animal health and welfare in the future. We've also set out already plans for the sustainable farming incentive. This is all about trying to incentivize a more sustainable approach to farming right across the farmed landscape. Initially, we're focusing on promoting soil health, but there will be future modules on things like sensitive hedgerow management and integrated pest management. Now, I know that some of the green NGOs were critical of the sustainable farming incentive when it was launched late last year, but I totally reject that criticism. The truth is that we will never deliver our targets for the environment unless we see some changes across the farmed landscape. The way that we manage our soils is inextricably linked to the quality of our watercourses, which has a direct impact on many of our protected sites. And we know that hedgerows are probably the single most important ecological building block that we have in the farmed landscape, and how we manage them matters. And we know that if we can incentivize integrated pest management and get a general reduction in pesticide use, that will also have an impact on invertebrates and things like pollinators. So it's going to be a crucial part of our approach to delivering the environmental targets that we've set ourselves. But today I want to say a bit more about the other two components of our future agriculture policy. That is local nature recovery and landscape recovery. Local nature recovery will replace the existing countryside stewardship schemes. Most holdings have a part of the farm that is perhaps not really suitable for crop production, or less productive, or difficult to work. There is an opportunity to make those parts of the holding a special space for nature. And it could be a part of a field, could be an area in a valley that's particularly suited to this, where there's an opportunity to create water features and ponds, to establish woodland creation within that farmed holding, to establish species-rich grassland, and to replicate some of the conditions of the traditional meadows, many of which we've lost, and to create breeding areas for wildlife. We've learned from the pilots that there's also a great deal of interest in partnership working, some real enthusiasm for groups of farmers in a particular geography coming together to do projects jointly. And we've made available facilitation funding to support that kind of partnership working, which has been so popular. And that will also be a feature of the new local nature recovery scheme. But in the meantime, we of course have countryside stewardship. And I want to say today that farmers should regard the countryside stewardship scheme as a bridge to local nature recovery. Last year, we saw a 40% increase in demand and applications for countryside stewardship. We now have over 40,000 farmers in England participating in either countryside stewardship or legacy HLS schemes. And we also know that if we can increase the numbers involved in this scheme, then it increases those who are prepared for the new local nature recovery scheme. So today, I can also announce that we are increasing the payment rates for countryside stewardship. It changes for different types of interventions, but on average, we are going to increase rates in countryside stewardship by around 30%. Now, this sends a powerful signal to farmers that we want them to get involved in countryside stewardship. For those who are early adopters and have already been engaged in countryside stewardship, they will automatically see an increase in the payments they receive for the work that they are already doing. But for those who've not yet engaged with countryside stewardship, the 40,000 or so who've chosen not to so far, I would urge them all to look again at countryside stewardship. We've made it simpler. We've removed some of the stifling bureaucracy that was a feature during the EU era, and we are, as I say, increasing those payment rates. Now, the final component of our future policy is landscape recovery. And this is going to be about much more fundamental land use change. To begin with, we're looking for 15 projects ranging in size from around 500 hectares to 5,000 hectares. It could be individual landowners or groups of landowners coming together. And one of the experiences and lessons that we've learned from projects like NEP, which is obviously a very radical rewilding experiment, is that sometimes if you let go of the reins and allow nature to reestablish itself and have a nature-led recovery of habitats, you can see some quite significant changes in a relatively short time frame. And the focus of the landscape recovery scheme is going to be very much, firstly, on recovering threatened species in England, and secondly, to support that objective, also delivering the recovery of priority habitats. Now, I should say that the types of projects we envisage under landscape recovery won't be right for every farm business or every farm holding. And indeed, they probably won't be right for most farm businesses, but it will be right for some. And it will enable us to support a choice that some landowners may want to take. But we won't be requiring anybody to enter these schemes. We will be putting in place the right incentives, the right kind of payment rates to support the choices of those who would like to do so. Now, it's important that we recognize the truth around land use. If we're to deliver the targets we've set ourselves for woodland creation in England, around 10,000 hectares of trees per year, and if we're to deliver our objective of getting 300,000 hectares of land where habitat is restored, there is inevitably going to be a degree of land use change. And I know that that causes some people some concern. But you have to look at the numbers we're looking at in the overall context of the fact that we have some 9.3 million hectares of farmland in England. And so we are only looking at change taking place on a relatively small area of that land. We, of course, need to keep a very close eye on food security. And as I said earlier, the government now has a legal responsibility to review our food security every 3 years. The first report of that food security review was published shortly before Christmas, and it shows that we have strong levels of self-sufficiency in many sectors at the moment. We also know that there isn't a direct correlation between the amount of land that is farmed and our agricultural output. Indeed, much of the growth we've had in agricultural output has come from sectors such as poultry and horticulture, which use very little land. And around 60% of our agricultural output comes from just 30% of land. So we know that it is entirely possible to maintain our food production, indeed to increase our food production, but to do so in a more sustainable way in some areas, and to also see some land use change in some other areas. Finally, it's important that we keep a close eye on farm profitability. As I said earlier, since the 2016 referendum result, farm incomes have generally recovered. Farm incomes and commodity prices are very closely linked to exchange rates and to oil prices, but there's also growing world demand as the population grows and as demand for some proteins also expands. As a result of this, we've seen the price of beef and sheep running at very strong levels. We've seen gross margins in some of the cereal sector increase by around 30%. And it's, of course, difficult to know at this stage how much of that change in farm gate prices is structural and how much of it is temporary. Exchange rates will inevitably change at some point again in the future. But it is possible that there will be some permanent structural change in those farm gate prices. And that's actually quite critical to us ensuring that we have profitable food production in this country. So in conclusion, I've always said that this should be an evolution, not a revolution. That's why we've set out a 7-year transition period. But I hope today I've been able to articulate the clear path that we have towards our final destination and the critical importance that schemes like Countryside Stewardship have to give farmers a bridge from the old schemes to the new. And in designing our future farming policy, we're not just thinking about the farmers of today, important though that is, we're also thinking about the farmers of tomorrow, the farmers we don't yet know, perhaps those who always yearned to go farming but couldn't get access to land. We have a whole generation leaving education today who are probably more environmentally conscious than previous generations. They're valuing different things in their career choices. They want to deliver things that are real and tangible and matter and make a difference. And I think there's an exciting future for the vision that we have for agriculture and sustainable agriculture and the delivery for nature and the environment that can attract that new generation to our industry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Secretary of State. And as before, I'm sure if we're in a meeting, you would be receiving a rapturous round of applause at this moment, but we'll just have to imagine it for the moment. Unsurprisingly, we've had a significant number of questions through in the last quarter of an hour or so. Some of them I think you've already dealt with in your comprehensive speech. And I have to go and say, recognising the radical nature of what the government is proposing, it's great to hear how it's being rolled out in stages. But I think there are a few questions from the audience which do pick up on some of the points you made. The first is, I think it was honest of you to accept that the new schemes aren't going to be for everyone. But what happens to the land farmed by those farmers who choose not to participate in the schemes? I mean, in many cases, to make up for the loss of BPS, they're going to have to intensify. Are you concerned about any environmental degradation resulting from that? So we end up with part of the country being environmentally vibrant and another part of the country being a far more industrialized agricultural landscape? Yes,
I think if you think about the continuum between the three components of our future policy that I've outlined, the first thing is that the sustainable farming incentive, we intend to be very much about incentivizing whole, holistic, on-farm approaches that are good for soil health and therefore good for crop health and good for farm profitability as well, supporting things like integrated pest management, supporting sensitive hedgerow management. Farmers will be able to adopt that sustainable farming incentive while still farming in quite a commercial way, but just farming in a slightly more sustainable way. And I therefore think that we will get, I hope over time, quite significant uptake in that scheme. And the key challenge for government, and it is a challenge for government, we're the ones with the environmental targets that are now legally binding that we've set ourselves. The challenge for us is to ensure that we make the payment rates attractive enough such that they incentivize the uptake of these schemes. Now, we made an initial starting point with the soil health standard, but there will be others on hedgerows, there will be others on integrated pest management, and we will also be increasing the level of ambition farmers can go to within that scheme. The second part is the local nature recovery. And, it is the case, I think, that most farm holdings will have a bit of the farm that's not the most productive, where they might find they'll be able to go into a local nature recovery scheme. And there will also be arable parts of the country in areas like East Anglia, where they may not have unproductive corners of the farm, but nevertheless, they would be able to, for instance, plant trees around field boundaries or even put shelter belts of trees through the field boundaries and would therefore be able to access the local nature recovery component. It's only really the third part, that landscape recovery, which is much more around fundamental land use change, that I think will be more reserved for those landowners in particular landscapes who make a particular choice to go in a particular direction. For most farmers, I would envisage that the sustainable farming incentive and local nature recovery will both become an important part of what they do. We already know that 50% of farmers are already in countryside stewardship, some 40,000 of them. And if it's not a big leap for them to move from the scheme that they're in to the local nature recovery scheme and sustainable farming incentive. And what I'm really saying today is we're increasing the rates that we're paying on countryside stewardship by 30%. That's a significant increase. And what I would encourage all farmers to do, those 40,000 who are not yet in countryside stewardship, is take a look at that scheme again, because it could be an important bridge to the future schemes we're rolling out.
Okay, thank you. And another point following on from that, the capacity of the RPA to administer what sounds like they're going to be 3 very new and rather complicated schemes. Each time the CAP got reformed, farming organisations and others expressed concerns about the capacity of the RPA. We were always told by your predecessors that everything was going to be hunky-dory. Then it wasn't, and it normally ended up with the then chief executive being sacked. How can you reassure us that this time around, with a domestic policy, things will work rather better than they had in the past?
Well, look, I'm very, very conscious, having borne the scars of the previous problems, that actually the implementation and delivery is everything. And so my big watchword with all of my officials, and I am having a regular meeting now with Paul Caldwell of the RPA as well, is that it is essential that we do not over-engineer and overcomplicate these schemes so that we have what could be a really good idea that falls down in delivery. And so I'm very, very hawkish on making sure that while, yes, we'll need to have some standards and some enforcement, that we make sure we give these schemes the room to grow and develop and to breathe. And that's what was so missing in the previous schemes. I have to say, I know people don't always like it when I say it, it was largely because of EU auditors. People forget that we used to get around £100 million a year fines from the EU auditors in so-called disallowance. That led to an incredibly risk-averse culture across Whitehall. It meant that all sorts of rules had to be put in place in order to appease EU auditors. We don't have that problem anymore. Those people have been swept aside, and it gives us the freedom to put in place the right kind of control regime that is proportionate. And I'm determined to ensure that that happens. I should also point out, just for the record, that Mark Grimshaw, I think, who's probably the former chief exec of the RPA you were referred to, while he left, was not at all culpable in the problems that there were with the IT system under the previous scheme. In fact, far from it, he was the one who had internally raised the alarm long before others that there was a problem with the system. And so I just wanted to make sure that we don't unfairly malign the name of Mark Grimshaw, since in truth he turned out to be right.
Sorry, I was going way back before Mark Grimshaw's time. Another question. There's a huge amount of flux in the industry resulting from Brexit and the desire to remake agricultural policy, which I think everyone understands. But this is at a time of immense change in the sector resulting from other factors. We did touch on this a bit in the panel discussion, but the massive rise in input costs in recent years is having a horrendous effect, particularly in the fruit and veg horticulture sector at the moment. Thinking about the increase in labour costs, fertiliser costs, etc. Does government think it has any obligation to take account of those sort of ancillary changes that are happening at the same time as the government inspired changes? And if so, what is your role?
Well, I think the key thing for me here is we've done some very interesting analysis about the relationship between farm gate prices and consumer prices. We had to do this extensively, actually, when we were preparing for a no-deal Brexit, when we were considering the potential impact of tariffs. And the really interesting thing is that you can actually see a reasonably strong increase in farm gate prices without that translating into a significant increase in consumer prices. And that's because, if I take an example, the value of wheat in the cost of producing a loaf of bread is roughly about 10% of the total costs. Most of the other costs are not linked to the value of the agricultural commodity. And that means you can actually see a good increase in the price of wheat without really affecting the price of bread much at all. And it's also the case that in areas such as red meat, where, yes, if you get an increase in farm gate prices, you will also typically see an increase in the retail price too. But the amount of spending on red meat in the average shopping basket is only about 3% of the total spend. And that means that the overall impact on consumer prices and the average shopping basket is actually quite low. And this is really quite encouraging because it means that we can see, I think, a recovery in farm gate prices, with farmers getting a stronger price, a fairer share of the value of the food that they're producing. And that need not have a significant impact on retail prices. Now, the one thing that's starting to happen already is that because of the rising labor costs, because we've been explicit actually in the future seasonal agricultural worker scheme that they must pay above the living wage rate. It's got to be a percentage above that. It's done for good reason. We don't want to undermine the domestic labor market. And I've had this discussion, for instance, in my own area with the daffodil industry. The daffodil industry now has access to seasonal labor. It's right that they should, because it's difficult for them to locate labor. But they should not have access to cheap labor, because the truth is a bunch of daffodils in supermarkets has been £1 a bunch pretty much for as long as anyone can remember. And there is no reason why the price of daffodils should not actually rise to maybe £1.10 a bunch. It should not be a psychological barrier, and there should not be a requirement on growers to source cheap labor so that they can produce their product at an undervalue just to meet some expectation of retailers. There needs to be an adjustment and a properly functioning market. So it will be the case that in some of these areas, we will need to see retailers paying more to reflect the increased costs of producers. And we do need producers to stand their ground and take quite a tough position with those retailers to ensure that the money that they're paid reflects the costs of their production.
Okay, thank you. What I think probably had to be the last question. And it's about what the government is doing to encourage new entrants into the sector, considering the average age of farmers. In saying this, I'm conscious of your proposals to help farmers, older farmers, to exit the scheme through the exit proposals that you're coming out with. In fact, am I right in saying that you were intending to go and have a policy statement on this by the end of last year? If so, where are we on that? And perhaps in a similar vein, where are we on the government response to the National Food Strategy?
Yes, so on the latter, there have been a number of projects run, including in Wales and in Cornwall, where of course I come from as well, that have looked at the issue of new entrants. And the general conclusion is that if you want to create opportunities for new entrants, you also need to address, the issue of farmers who want to retire, and you need to allow and encourage farmers to retire with dignity. That's why we have the exit scheme, where we'll be paying farmers multiples of their BPS payments in order to surrender their entitlements and either rent their land or surrender their tenancy. And in doing so, I hope that we'll create a stronger pipeline of new opportunities for new entrants coming into the industry. Linked to that, we're also working on a project to revitalise the old county farm model, so that it becomes much more of an incubator model, where we have things like business mentoring and training, and maybe buyer groups to support new entrants to get on that first rung of the ladder. And we're in discussion with some of the county farms and some of the other estates on that in that regard as well. We've not made the announcement on the voluntary exit scheme yet, simply because I'm still in dialogue with HMRC around how any payments might be treated for tax. There are differing views on how that should be done, and it's still something that we are discussing. But I would envisage that we'd make an announcement on that shortly, hopefully in the next month or so. And then finally, on the food strategy that you mentioned, it is our intention in the spring to publish a response to that. I think that Henry Dimbleby's review was very comprehensive, powerfully written, lots of cogent analysis in there. There are elements that I very much share and indeed have been reflected on in my speech and my contribution today, and other areas as well where he made recommendations that obviously pertain to other government departments that I'll be discussing with those relevant ministers before we draft our response.
Okay. George Eustice, Secretary of State, thank you so much. We've sadly reached the end of the time. Apologies to all of those questions that we couldn't manage to get to in the session but I hope in the course of the 2 sessions we've had that most of what people were asking about have been touched on to at least some extent. So again, thank you, Secretary of State, on behalf of the directors of the conference and all of the many attendees we have online with you this morning. So thank you.
Thank you very much.